In the forests of Central America, stone pyramids still rise above the canopy. For over 2,000 years, the Maya built cities, tracked the stars, and developed one of the most sophisticated writing systems in the ancient Americas. But by the 9th century, many of their greatest centers had been abandoned. The collapse was not sudden. It unfolded across generations, shaped by pressures that accumulated slowly and quietly. The Maya were not a single empire. They were a collection of city-states, each with its own rulers and allegiances. These cities shared a common culture, language, and calendar system, but they governed independently. At their height, centers like Tikal, Copan, and Calakmul supported tens of thousands of people. They built reservoirs, terraced hillsides, and carved trade routes through dense jungle. But this success carried hidden costs. Evidence from soil, samples, and pollen records indicates that the Maya transformed their environment on a massive scale. Forests were cleared to make room for agriculture. Hillsides were reshaped into terraces. Wetlands were drained and converted into raised fields. For centuries, this system worked, supported growing populations, and allowed cities to expand. Over time, the land began to show strain. Deforestation reduced the forest's ability to retain moisture. Soil erosion increased, particularly on steep slopes where terraces required constant maintenance. Nutrients leached from overworked fields. Yields, once reliable, became less predictable. Historians suggest that by the 8th century, many regions were producing less food despite greater effort. Population density had reached levels that left little margin for error. Cities that had grown steadily for generations now depended on every harvest. Storage systems could buffer against a single bad year, but not against repeated failures. The balance between people and resources had become precarious. Any disruption to the agricultural cycle created immediate hardship. Water was always a challenge in the Maya lowlands. The region has no major rivers, and much of the limestone bedrock absorbs rainfall quickly. Cities relied on reservoirs, cisterns, and seasonal streams. During the dry season, water management required careful planning. Archaeological evidence shows that some reservoirs were expanded multiple times, suggesting increasing difficulty in meeting demand. Between the 8th and 9th centuries, climate records point to a series of prolonged droughts. These were not isolated events. Evidence from lake sediments and cave formations indicates that rainfall declined repeatedly over several decades. For a civilization already stretching its resources, these droughts added unbearable pressure. Fields that once yielded surplus now struggled to produce enough for basic needs. As resources tightened, political landscape became more fragmented. City-states that had once cooperated now competed more directly. Trade routes shifted, alliances weakened. The administrative systems that coordinated labor, taxation, and distribution grew more strained. Evidence from inscriptions shows that construction projects slowed or stopped entirely in many cities during this period. The infrastructure that maintained urban life required constant attention, and that attention was increasingly difficult. To sustain trade networks that had connected distant cities began to fracture. Obsidian from the highlands, salt from coastal regions, and jade from distant quarries had flowed along established routes for centuries. These networks were not merely economic. They carried information, reinforced alliances, and distributed resources across ecological zones. When cities weakened, these connections became less reliable. Communities became more isolated, less able to draw on the strengths of the wider network. The Maya elite were supported by a complex system of tribute, labor, and religious authority. Temples were not simply monuments. They were centers of ritual. In timekeeping, tied to agricultural cycles and political legitimacy. But as conditions worsened, the systems that justified elite control came under strain. If the rains did not come, if the harvests failed, the rituals and assurances offered by the ruling class lost their persuasive power. Research points to signs of social stress during the final decades of many cities. Construction quality declined. Monumental inscriptions became less frequent. Some sites show evidence of hastily built defensive walls, suggesting rising insecurity. people began to leave. Not all at once, but gradually, in waves. They moved to smaller settlements, to regions with more reliable water, or to areas less dependent on intensive agriculture. The abandonment was uneven. Some cities declined rapidly. Others persisted for decades, even as their populations shrank. Northern cities in the Yucatan continued to flourish long after the southern lowlands had been largely abandoned. The Maya did not disappear. Their descendants continued to live in the region, though the great urban centers were left behind. What is striking about the Mayan decline is its complexity. There was no single cause. Instead, there was a convergence of pressures. Environmental degradation, climate stress, political fragmentation, and administrative overextension all reinforced one another. Each problem made the others harder to solve. The systems that had sustained the civilization for centuries became rigid and unable to adapt. The institutions that had built the pyramids and organized thousands of workers could not easily change course. They were designed for expansion and stability, not for contraction and crisis. When conditions demanded flexibility, the existing structures proved difficult to reshape. Investments made in one generation became burdens for the next. The very success of earlier centuries created expectations and obligations that later populations struggled to meet. The Mayan story is not one of sudden catastrophe. It is a story of accumulation. Small decisions made over generations, each reasonable in its moment, created conditions that became unsustainable. The clearing of a forest, the expansion of a terrace, the construction of a monument, none of these alone caused collapse. Together, they set in motion processes that the Maya could not easily reverse. The evidence remains incomplete. Much of what we know comes from fragments, broken pottery, buried seeds, stone inscriptions worn by time. Historians and archaeologists continue to debate the weight of each factor. But the pattern is clear. The collapse was not an event. It was a process, unfolding over lifetimes, as systems that once balanced began to fail. In the end, the great cities were abandoned not because of a single disaster, but because the pressures they faced, environmental, economic, and social, became impossible to sustain. The decline was gradual, shaped by forces that no one fully controlled and few could foresee. The civilization had endured for over a millennium, adapting to challenges and building remarkable achievements. But even the most sophisticated systems have limits, and the Maya reached theirs, not through any single failure, but through the accumulated weight of interconnected stresses. What remains are the monuments, silent among the trees, reminders of a civilization that lasted centuries before the weight of its own complexity brought it slowly to a close.